Grace folded her laundry the same way every week, sorted her books alphabetically, lined her coffee mugs by color. Her world was neat, predictable, safe. Until one night, while scrolling past smiling puppies and shelter promotions, she stopped. A single photo, a dog that didn't look back at the camera. A golden retriever lying in a cage as if trying to disappear. Something about his silence reached through the screen. And something inside Grace, something long buried, answered back. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. It was early November in Port Haven, a small coastal town nestled in the northern edge of Maine, where the Atlantic winds blew sharp and cold, and the streets smelled of sea salt and pine. The sky that evening was painted in slate gray, and the clouds hung low over the town like a ceiling about to collapse. A light drizzle coated everything in a fine mist, and the last golden leaves clung desperately to bare branches, trembling against the wind. At the edge of town, just past the rusted docks and abandoned lobster shacks, stood the Port Haven Animal Shelter, a squat concrete building with peeling green paint and fogged-up windows. Inside, the rows of metal cages echoed with the sharp barks and anxious whines of dozens of dogs, each hoping to catch a glimpse of salvation through the narrow walkway that visitors occasionally passed through. But Marley, a 6-year-old golden retriever with dull light cream fur and a faint scar along his right ear, made no sound at all. He lay curled in the far corner of his cage, motionless, his eyes open but unfocused. Marley had once been a family dog. He had known warm living rooms, the scent of a backyard barbecue, and the slow petting of a hand that loved him. But that life ended when his owner, a widower named Frank Holden, passed away from a sudden heart attack 3 months ago. Marley had been found days later guarding Frank's body with such stillness that the paramedics thought he too had died. He hadn't barked since. Despite his breed's usual friendliness, Marley had been labeled unresponsive and withdrawn during his evaluations. Volunteers had tried treats, soft voices, toys, but Marley flinched at sudden movements and retreated at every open gate. Some assumed trauma. Others called it stubbornness. Either way, his profile was stamped low adoption potential. Now he had been moved to the farthest row where dogs with no future were kept, one step away from the back room. That night, as the shelter staff locked up, and the last echo of human footsteps faded, Marley remained still. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, reflecting off the damp floor. The other dogs whined and paced, but Marley didn't join them. Instead, a small sound escaped him, a low, almost inaudible whimper. It wasn't a cry for attention, it was resignation. Across town, in a second-story apartment above a hardware store on Maple Street, Grace Holloway, a 34-year-old veterinary technician, sat curled on her couch phone, in hand scrolling aimlessly. Grace was tall, lean, with auburn hair she always tied back, and a pair of tired gray eyes that had once been bright and curious. Her colleagues often described her as kind but distant, a woman whose warmth flickered beneath a layer of guarded silence. 3 weeks ago, Grace had broken off an engagement with her longtime partner, a paramedic named Drew. The breakup hadn't been dramatic, just the slow realization that they were growing apart. But it had left her hollow. She'd filled her days with long shifts at the clinic and her nights with silence. The small apartment, once cozy with two, now felt sterile and echoing. She had always wanted a dog, but work hours, small space, and now the emotional wreckage had all seemed like excuses to avoid the commitment. Still, something compelled her to open a local shelter's Instagram page that evening. A grainy photo caught her eye, a golden retriever lying curled in a cage, his body turned away from the camera, but his eyes, wide empty and heavy, stared directly into the lens. The caption read, "Marley, male, 6 YO Golden Retriever. Needs a home by tomorrow. Scheduled for euthanasia at 10 a.m. Grace sat up straighter. Something stirred deep inside her. It wasn't just sadness, it was recognition, as if the sorrow in those eyes mirrored the weight in her chest. She clicked on the post. There was a brief history unadoptable, withdrawn, not aggressive, but silent. She zoomed in, the scar on the ear, the way his body folded into itself like he was trying to vanish. "You can't save them all," she whispered the phrase she'd heard dozens of times in her line of work, but somehow tonight it rang hollow. Without thinking, she tapped the shelter's phone number and pressed it to her ear. No one picked up. It was after hours. But the voicemail beeped, and her voice came out quiet but sure. "Hi, this is Grace Holloway. I just saw your post about Marley. Please don't put him down. I'll be there when you open. I want to meet him. I want to help." She ended the call and stared at the ceiling. Her heart thudded, her breath unsteady, but there was also something else, clarity. For the first time in weeks, the numbness cracked. Outside, the drizzle turned to rain, tapping gently against the window pane. In the shelter, Marley shifted slightly, his head lifting just an inch. He blinked his eyes, flicking toward the bars. Nothing had changed in the room. No one had come. But still, he let out a deep sigh, a breath that felt different, as if something had shifted in the wind. The sky above Port Haven was still heavy with clouds as dawn broke over the sleepy coastal town. A thin mist clung to the streets, and the scent of brine and wood smoke lingered in the air. Seagulls called from the docks, and far out at sea, a faint line of orange split the sky, promising light, but not warmth. Grace Holloway stood outside the Port Haven animal shelter, her hands jammed deep into the pockets of her wool coat. The building looked even more dismal in the morning light. Its paint-chipped windows fogged the air around it, humming with a tired silence. She'd barely slept. Marley's eyes from the photo still echoed in her mind, vacant, distant, but not gone. Something was still in there. The door opened with a buzz, and Sandra Knox, the shelter manager, greeted her with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Sandra, a woman in her 40s with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that had seen too many hopeful adoptions fall through, raised an eyebrow at Grace. "You're here early," she said. "I left the message about Marley." Grace replied. Her voice was even, but her stomach fluttered. Sandra gave a half nod. "I remember. Look, I won't sugarcoat it. He's been here weeks. Doesn't bark, doesn't wag. We've tried volunteers, treats, even sent therapy, nothing. Some dogs just don't come back from whatever happened to them." "I'd still like to meet him," Grace said quietly. With a resigned sigh, Sandra led her through the narrow hall of the shelter. Dogs barked and scratched against cages as they passed, but the noise faded as they reached the farthest row, quiet, isolated, and dimly lit. At the end of the line was Marley. The 6-year-old golden retriever lay curled tightly in the back corner of his cage. His cream-colored fur looked dull under the flickering fluorescent light, and the faint scar on his right ear was barely visible through the loose strands. He didn't lift his head when they approached. He didn't move at all. Sandra didn't open the cage. He panics when the door swings open. It's better to let him come to you if he wants. Grace crouched near the bars, lowering her voice to a gentle murmur. "Hey, Marley." "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." At her voice, Marley's ears twitched. Slowly, cautiously, his head lifted a few inches off the floor. His eyes met hers, dull, yes, but not empty. There was a flicker, a shimmer of light behind them, like the last ember in a fire, refusing to die. She slid her hand through the bars, palm up, unmoving. Marley sniffed once. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward and touched his nose to her fingers. "He's never done that," Sandra said. Quietly, stunned, not once. "I'd like to take him home," Grace replied. Within an hour, the papers were signed. Marley didn't resist as Sandra gently leashed him and walked him to the car. He moved slowly mechanically with his tail down and body low, but there was no fight in him, only a strange, solemn acceptance. Grace opened the passenger door, laid out a blanket, and helped him up. He didn't look at her again, only stared out the window as she pulled away from the shelter. Her home was a small gray clapboard house near the docks with chipping white trim and a view of the harbor beyond. The porch creaked under their weight, and the sea breeze carried the scent of fish pine and rusted chains. Grace unlocked the door and stepped back, giving Marley space. He hesitated at the threshold, nose twitching, then crossed into the living room with slow, cautious steps. The room was modest but warm, soft lighting, a faded sofa, a dog bed near the front window, and 2 ceramic bowls in the kitchen already filled. Marley didn't inspect anything. He simply walked to the corner of the room and lay down with his back against the wall, facing her in silence. Grace didn't speak. She sat on the floor across from him, not too close, her legs, crossed hands resting in her lap. They stayed that way for a long time. Across the narrow street from a second-story window shrouded in lace curtains, Eleanor Doyle watched them both. Eleanor was 78, small, and stooped, her silver-white hair pinned in a bun. She wore a thick-knit sweater and long brown skirt, her hands cradling a chipped mug of tea. Her eyes were faded but sharp, a shade of stormy gray, and as she watched the golden dog settle into the corner of Grace's living room, her breath caught. For a moment she wasn't old. She was 16 again, laughing in a garden, while her dog, Rusty, a loyal, grinning golden retriever, chased butterflies in the grass. The shape of Marley was different, but something in his eyes, the heavy way he moved, tugged at a memory buried deep. She lowered her cup and whispered to no one. "Rusty." Then she turned from the window, heart trembling with something between joy and pain. The days in Port Haven grew shorter, and by late afternoon a pale blue dusk had already begun to settle over the town. Cold air clung to the harbor, creeping between shingles and beneath door frames, carrying with it the scent of salt and pine and the whisper of the coming winter. Inside the small clapboard house near the docks, Marley lay motionless in the corner of the living room, his back pressed tightly against the wall. It had been 3 days since Grace brought him home. He hadn't barked, hadn't wagged, hadn't explored much beyond a few cautious paces around the furniture. He ate very little, just enough to survive, and slept in fitful bursts, his ears flicking at every creak of the floor or gust of wind against the window. Grace watched it all quietly, saying little, offering space instead of demands. Grace herself had changed her routines to accommodate him. The living room floor had become her preferred workspace. She moved her laptop from the desk to the coffee table, sat cross-legged on the rug nearby, and spoke only when necessary. She didn't reach for him or try to lure him close with treats. Instead, she simply existed in parallel, letting Marley decide when or if he was ready. One evening, just as the sky turned the color of bruised lavender, there was a soft knock at the door. Grace stood brushing the creases from her sweater and opened it. On the other side stood Eleanor Doyle, bundled in a long beige coat and holding a small paper bag. Her silver-white hair was pinned back in its usual loose bun, and her cheeks were rosy from the wind. There was a faint scent of cinnamon and cloves about her. "Thought I'd stop by," Eleanor said with a polite smile, extending the bag. "These are for your new friend. Homemade. Peanut butter and oats. I used to make them for Rusty. He was mad for them." Grace accepted the bag with gentle hands and a warm nod. "Thank you. That's really kind." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, peering past Grace's shoulder into the room. Her eyes fell on Marley, who remained still in his corner, his gaze low, his tail tucked beneath him. "He reminds me of Rusty," she said softly. "Not just in looks, but in that sadness." Rusty was a rescue, too. Found him in a ditch just outside of Bar Harbor when I was barely 17. Skinny bleeding, scared of everything. Grace leaned against the doorframe, listening. Eleanor's eyes misted. When I was about 20, I fell down the old basement stairs. Broke my ankle clean. I was alone. My parents were out. But Rusty, he barked and barked until the neighbors came. Sat next to me the whole time. I swear he didn't blink once. There was a long pause between them, filled only by the distant cry of a gull and the rhythmic hush of waves against the shore. Grace glanced back at Marley. He hasn't moved much, barely eats. I don't think he trusts the quiet. That'll come, Eleanor replied, adjusting her scarf. With time and kindness, even the deepest wounds soften. Just don't stop talking to him. Even if he doesn't answer, I won't, Grace said. Eleanor gave her hand a brief squeeze. Good girl, she murmured, then turned and made her way slowly back across the street, her cane clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk. That night, Grace left a bag of biscuits on the floor near Marley's water bowl, then turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of a table lamp to warm the room. She curled up on the couch with a worn fleece blanket and a book. She never really started, her mind too preoccupied with the silent creature a few feet away. Marley didn't touch the biscuits, but sometime after midnight, when the wind had died down and the house was cloaked in stillness, Marley shifted. It was barely a sound, just the faint slide of a paw against the floor. Grace, half asleep, didn't stir. The room was quiet enough that even the rustle of fur could be heard. Marley rose slowly, stretching one leg, then another, his joints stiff from days curled in place. He moved not toward the food, but toward the front window. The curtains were partially open, revealing the dark silhouette of the street and the house across from theirs, where a single upstairs window still glowed faintly. He sat in front of it, tail curled to the side, body stiff but upright. For a while, he stared toward the window where Eleanor often stood during the day. There was no movement now, no figure behind the glass, but something about that space held him. Marley didn't whine, didn't bark. He simply watched. Then, as if comforted by the act, he lowered his body slowly to the rug and rested his chin on his paws, still facing the window, and closed his eyes. The wind off the harbor had a different character that afternoon, cool, but not bitter, brisk, but not harsh. It carried the scent of salt seaweed and distant engine oil, the familiar perfume of Port Haven's working docks. Gulls circled in wide arcs overhead, their cries sharp against the low hum of the town. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, with wisps of cloud clinging loosely above the water. It was the kind of day where change seemed to float on the breeze. Grace stood on the porch of her small house with a leash in hand, watching Marley through the screen door. The golden retriever was lying near the window, his body relaxed, but his ears tilted toward her, as if he already knew what she wanted to ask. For days now, his behavior had shifted in small, cautious steps, moving from the corner to the rug, from the rug to the window, and now watching her more openly. "Do you want to go out, Marley?" she asked softly. He didn't move at first, but when she opened the door and stepped aside, Marley slowly got up. He stretched one leg at a time, then padded over to her. Grace knelt to attach the leash, giving him a moment to sniff it, to process it. When she clipped it onto his collar, he didn't flinch. They stepped out together. Grace led him through the quiet neighborhood where fallen leaves danced along the sidewalks. A few neighbors waved, including Mr. Langston, an older man in a yellow windbreaker, who always tended to his porch plants even though winter was approaching. His tabby cat Bingo lounged on the windowsill behind him. Bingo was old, chubby, and perpetually unimpressed. He lifted his head to glare at Marley, then closed his eyes again. Marley stayed close to Grace's side. His steps were slow but steady, his gaze flicking toward passing cars and blowing leaves, but he didn't pull away. It was his first real walk since arriving, and every few steps Grace glanced down at him searching for signs of tension. He didn't wag his tail, but he didn't freeze either. It was enough. They reached the harbor walkway where wooden benches lined the path and the sea slapped gently against the retaining wall. Rusted lobster traps were stacked beside fishing shacks and seagulls danced overhead, hoping for scraps. Marley sniffed the air, then sat beside one of the benches, his eyes focused on the rippling gray water. Grace sat down, letting the leash remain loose in her fingers. "Not bad, huh?" she murmured. For a while, they simply sat there, woman and dog quiet together, the harbor breathing in slow rhythms. Then a sharp human cry pierced the air. Grace turned her head toward the sound and saw a figure stumbling backward near a bench farther down the path. It was Eleanor Doyle, her beige coat flapping in the wind, one hand clutching her purse, while the other struggled to fend off a young man tugging at the strap. He was wiry and thin, barely older than 20, with a beanie pulled low over his head and a hoodie zipped halfway up. His face was pale, angular, and twitchy, the kind of face marked by desperation rather than malice. Grace jumped to her feet, heart pounding. "Eleanor!" The man pulled harder, and Eleanor staggered. Then Marley moved. It wasn't a slow, careful step this time. It was instinct. With a sudden surge of energy, Marley bolted forward, his body stretched low, his paws slapping the pavement. The leash snapped taut in Grace's hand, nearly pulling her off balance, and a loud, deep bark erupted from Marley's throat. Not a whimper, not a cry, a warning. The young man turned startled by the unexpected sound. Marley's bark rang out again, louder this time, chest shaking and primal. The man's eyes widened as he backed away from Eleanor, raising both hands. Hey, it's just a bag. Man, calm down." But Marley didn't advance. He stood his ground legs braced, barking once more before falling silent. His eyes locked on the intruder. The man didn't wait. He turned and ran, disappearing between two bait shacks without looking back. Grace hurried forward, breathless. "Eleanor, are you okay?" The older woman stood rooted in place, one hand still on her purse, the other pressed to her chest. Her cheeks were pale, her hair wind-blown, but her eyes were steady. I'm fine, dear," she said, her voice thin. "Bit shaken, that's all. Nothing broken. He didn't get anything." Marley had stopped barking and now stood between the two women, ears tilted forward, body relaxed, but alert. His tail gave a single tentative wag. Eleanor looked down at him, eyes wide with wonder. "You saved me," she whispered. Then she bent slightly, her knees creaking, and reached out a trembling hand. Marley didn't pull away. He let her touch his head. She stroked behind his ears gently. "Rusty used to bark just like that," Eleanor said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're just like him, a little rusty." Marley's ears twitched. Then, to everyone's astonishment, his tail gave another wag. Slight, unsteady, but deliberate. Grace blinked. "Did he?" "He did," Eleanor whispered, smiling. They walked Eleanor home slowly, Marley walking proudly between them like a quiet guardian. At the front steps of her home, Eleanor turned and patted his head again. "Thank you, little Rusty," she said softly. Marley looked up at her, and this time he didn't look away. The days rolled by with a gentler rhythm in Port Haven. Winter crept in slowly, not with harsh winds or icy storms, but with soft gray mornings and silver fog that curled through alleyways and lingered over the docks. At Grace Holloway's little seaside home, something else had shifted too, something quieter and deeper than the changing season. Marley had begun to bloom. It was not sudden, not marked by a dramatic moment or gesture, but a steady and quiet evolution. Each morning, Grace would wake to find Marley lying not in his distant corner, but stretched out on the rug beside the couch. His eyes half closed his tail, giving a lazy thump when she greeted him. He still didn't bark without cause, but the stillness in him was no longer fear, it had become calm. He ate more, now even trotted to his bowl when she poured his kibble, and though he didn't play like younger dogs, he sometimes pressed his head into her palm and let it rest there for minutes at a time. It was Grace's favorite gesture, that silent offering of trust. Some mornings, Grace and Marley would walk to the harbor where Eleanor Doyle waited on a bench bundled in her thick gray coat and oversized knit scarf. Marley would approach her calmly, position himself beside her like a quiet sentry, and sit there watching the tide as if he too had once known what it meant to be lost at sea. "He reminds me of a lighthouse," Eleanor once said gently, scratching behind his ears. "Stands quiet but always watching, always waiting." Grace smiled. Maybe he's the one who needed to be found. One crisp afternoon, Grace decided it was time for Marley to visit the vet, not because of any signs of illness, but simply because it felt like part of honoring his new life. It was a declaration Marley was not just surviving anymore. He was living. The Seaview Veterinary Clinic was a small, well-kept building near the bluff, its white siding framed by cedar trees. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and lavender air freshener mingled with the quiet hum of soft classical music. Behind the reception desk stood Dr. Lenora Blake, a petite woman in her early 40s with cropped copper hair and an energy that felt both clinical and compassionate. Her manner was brisk but not cold, a woman who had spent years soothing both animals and the people who loved them. "You're the one who adopted the shelter ghost," she said with a knowing smile when Grace gave her Marley's name. "Heard the staff talking about him. They said he barely moved for weeks." "He's still quiet," Grace replied, "but it's different now." Marley stood beside her, alert but not anxious. His ears twitched at the sound of a barking terrier in the next room, but he didn't pull away. Dr. Blake knelt to greet him. "Hey, handsome," she murmured. "Mind if I take a look?" The examination went smoothly. Heart, teeth, joints all healthy, save for some residual stiffness and an old scar along his hind leg. But as she scanned him with the microchip reader, the device let out a sudden sharp beep that startled even her. She frowned and turned the screen toward Grace. "That's not one of the local chips," she said. "Let me run this through the broader registry." It took a few minutes. Grace sat beside Marley, her hand resting on his back, feeling the tension ripple beneath his fur. When Dr. Blake returned, her expression was more serious. "The chip traces back to a company called Protego Dynamics," she said. "They were a private canine contractor training dogs for security protection surveillance, but they were shut down last year after an investigation uncovered illegal practices. There were reports of abuse. Most of the dogs were seized or went missing when the company collapsed." Grace stared at her stunned. "So, Marley, he was one of theirs." "It looks that way," Dr. Blake said softly. "But the registry has been wiped. No ownership records remain. He's clean now. No claims. He's yours, officially and permanently." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she reached for Marley's collar. He leaned into her, sensing the change in mood. "Whatever he went through," Dr. Blake added, "he's out of it now. And from the look of him, he's lucky to have landed with someone who sees past the silence." Later that day, Grace and Marley walked back to the harbor together. The sun was low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of copper and rose, and the ocean shimmered like a quilt of fire. The wind was gentle, lifting strands of Grace's hair as she stepped onto the wooden walkway near the edge of the bay. Marley stopped beside her and looked out at the water. Grace knelt beside him. "You're free now," she whispered. "No more cages, no more orders, just sea and sky." Marley turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. Then he did something he had never done before. He lay down against her side, pressing the full weight of his body into her, and rested his head gently across her leg. Grace placed her hand on his neck, her thumb stroking the soft fur behind his ear. Together they watched the tide roll in, slow, certain, and unafraid. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not in flashes of light or grand gestures, but in quiet moments of trust, rebuilt step by step, breath by breath. Marley's journey from a forgotten soul in a cage to a beloved companion beside the sea is proof that healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds. It is a reminder that love, when given patiently, selflessly, and with faith, can redeem even the most broken spirits. Perhaps it wasn't just time or kindness that brought Marley back, but something greater, something divine. Maybe God places certain animals in our lives to teach us about grace, loyalty, and second chances. Maybe His hand was in every quiet moment, every wag of a tail, every unspoken bond. In our everyday lives, we often pass by people and even animals who are silently crying out for help. Let Marley's story be a whisper to your heart. Don't ignore the quiet ones. Don't give up on the ones the world forgets. You never know when God might be working a miracle through your compassion. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Comment your thoughts and subscribe to this channel to support more stories like Marley's. And if you believe in the power of love, healing, and divine grace, comment Amen to send a prayer of protection for every soul still waiting to be found. May God bless you. May He bless the forgotten, and may He lead us to be the miracle someone needs.